I'm honored and privileged to be here because we have this wonderful interaction between economists, world bankers, lawyers, political scientists, and students. It's very rare for that to happen on Africa. And so I think what we're going to benefit from this is the dialogue and the differences in approaches on these issues. What I hope to do is to join the last panel before us to look at the micro aspect of a much wider discourse that took place yesterday. I thought that the panels yesterday were extraordinary in giving us the bigger picture. My discussion today will look at it from the bottom up and probably draw some implications for the wider discussion of the relationship between resources and conflicts in Africa. But a story about the Nigerian finance minister, who is now the managing director of the World Bank. I got this from a British official. Nigeria was applying for the restructuring of its external loan and debt forgiveness. And Washington and DC and London got together and said, okay, we need technical competence to manage the finance ministry and the petroleum sector and all that as part of the wider package of debt relief. So they tapped Ngozi Iweala, who was a World Banker, and said, we want you to make her Minister of Finance. And Obasanjo said, absolutely not. He said, okay, well, we're not going to help you out with the loan. And the dialogue went back and forth. Eventually, he knew that she became a phenomenal finance minister and helped put Nigeria back on a very different fiscal, I think, part of fiscal discipline that was very different from before. Why am I saying this? The international dimensions of these conflicts are especially serious. The external environment is a factor in the problem and therefore must be seen as a factor in the solution. We miss that and we miss the wider issues of the discussion today. So let me just give you an idea of what I want to deal with. First, 4 kinds of questions, not all of which I intend to answer. Some of them I will. Do resources cause conflict? And I put cause in italics to emphasize that, the causal relationship. Are certain kinds of resources more likely than others to cause conflicts? Because we have cocoa, we have copper. Ndulu told us Zambia is a major producer of copper. And yet, Zambia, to the best of my knowledge, doesn't have the kinds of problems of conflict that we have in the Niger Delta or other countries. Ghana will start producing oil in huge quantities. Chances are Ghana is not going to have the kind of civil war that Nigeria did. So what is it? Is it because of oil really per se, or is it because of natural resources widely defined? The third is, are there mediating factors then, you could see my suspicion, between resources and conflicts? And I say, yeah, there are intermediate variables. And if so, what are they? I ask these questions in order to underline a fundamental point, and part of this is to get into the Niger Delta thing, and that is governance. When Clinton was running for election the first time, he said his campaign was, is the economy stupid? And he's right, for the United States. For many African countries, it's not the economy, it's the governance stupid. And the reason why that is because we're dealing with the process of state formation. Ndulu's point about capacity is precisely that. How do you handle a situation where states emerged in circumstances that are either sui generis or maybe not too sui generis, but they are competing in a global environment in which established states have extraordinary advantage. And the methods of building states today are vastly different from the methods of building states 100 and 120 years ago. So how do you resolve that? I think that's part of the dilemma that we have. A path that has been suggested, and I think one that is very useful, is democracy. It has its problems, but I'm going to discuss a little bit further how that and why that is. The other element of it, at least in the literature, Ndulu's work is very seminal here, that governance has to be related to economic performance. That fascinates economics. It fascinates world bankers. For political scientists, however, that is very questionable, and I mean that. Efficiency is good, But society has other goals other than simply economic efficiency. One of them is how do you build an identity? And identity questions are very important. Oftentimes they run contrary to economic benefits. Does it make sense? To some, maybe no, rational economic model. To others, it means a lot about what these identities say. So that we may want to look at the issue of natural resources and governance in a more nuanced way. Ideally, we want to see a functioning state where economic performance is a big deal. In reality, that's not going to happen. If African states were very successful in managing the economic resources, I think we should ask, oh my God, how did that happen? Because nothing in their history or in their ability should give us any reason to think that they will be able to do that. Second deriving from that is that we are very suspicious of conflict. And I use that differently than war. Conflict is actually a good thing. In fact, sometimes it's necessary. Part of what we should be concerned with is how do we resolve conflict peacefully and through an internal process that is able to promote harmony. Okay? I wrestle with Bates a little bit. I love him very dearly. Nick isn't here. Part of the argument, and you remember Kaplan, part of the argument he does here, he picks up on Duluth's work here, is about control regimes. How did African governments get to this point where they became very fascinated with control regimes? In other words, closed governments that control trade, controlled investments, and all the economic inefficiencies that created. Beautiful question. His answer, I'm not quite sure, at least his telling of the story, he began after independence. I don't think so. He predated that. But it's a powerful question. How is it that governments simply chose to determine who gets licenses, why they get licenses, for how long they get licenses, what profits is going to be derived from that, and all that? Okay, it's about power. And it's about maintaining a code of loyalty, not an African thing sui generis, but it's part of a wider problem of politics in general. Maintaining a code of loyalty around those who govern. And we see that with the conflicts that we have in Liberia and all that. But my more recent and impressive example is Cote d'Ivoire. The rebels got in there, in the palace. They couldn't pick up Babo. Why? They couldn't find him. They don't know the bunker. They have no idea what the complex looks like. Babo had, a tunnel between the Ivorian presidential palace and the embassy of France. It was built by Babo's successor. Babo got angry and blocked it. The French knew it because they built it. So when they went in there, they got him out fairly quickly. What is this saying? African states are extremely vulnerable to external forces. And so we can use that in many ways, in a reverse way, by using those external influences to try to correct some of the problems that exist at home. Then the strategic significance of oil in this century, and that goes to the point of sustainability that the last speaker made. Okay, let me get you to the story of Nigeria. This is Nigeria. I want you to look at the southern part and look at those rigs. That's towards the Gulf of Guinea. Increasingly, however, this is a fairly older map. Increasingly, you would have seen more of these rigs right there in the Gulf of Guinea, because oil exploration in Nigeria has moved from inland to offshore. And it was not because there is necessarily more oil in the offshore areas, but because of the political risk, increasing political risk of mining oil inland, okay? And how about infrastructure and terminals? I love this one. I asked a question about technical capacity before, and it is about two terminals. There are two major terminals of export in Nigeria, one in Bonny and the other one at Escravos. So that when conflict came, it became very easy to disrupt supply. All you have to do is blow up any of them, and you have caused a tremendous dislocation in the industry. And the reason why Bonny is the key terminal is, again, for reasons of history. Oil production. Nigeria began producing oil in commercial quantities in 1958. 1.9 million barrels per annum. Look at what happens by 1960. It jumps by more than 500 percentage points to 12.3. But look at the rest of the story. By 1967, Civil War, 95 million barrels per annum, and it's going to exceed that quickly. But look at this graph, and it tells a much wider story about Nigeria. It's not so much that the quantity of oil declined, because it did not. Actually, it did increase. But the rate of change was phenomenal. So Nigeria had basically borrowed against high oil productivity, new universities, because those things did not exist during colonial era, new elementary schools, high schools, road networks, didn't do much on railways, but worked on airports, plus rebuilding a war economy and all that. But it was also anticipating a consistent growth in oil production. That did not happen. What we began to see was almost a flatlining of the growth picture between 1970 and 2007. Okay? You still produce more oil, but the rate of growth had now normalized to about 14% per annum and thereabout. But you're already obligated to the tune of billions of dollars based on expectation of extraordinarily high crude production. This would have significant impact on politics. Not surprisingly, look at the roughest years in Nigerian politics. See what happens? By 1999, Nigeria was almost completely a failed state. Okay? Abacha had succeeded in running it down. But look at also what happened during that period. We have seen a profound decline in the rate of growth, but also of income. Oil was trading for about $10 per barrel. It didn't give him enough money in his hands to be able to settle the conflicting groups. You call that corruption, right? But it's about basically appeasing opposition groups, whatever they may be. They may be ethnic, they may be religious, and all that. He just didn't have the cash. Not surprisingly, he will pay very heavily for it. So then what really are the causes of this conflict? Well, in general, I call it the angst, because it's genuine anger on the part of a people about a lot of things. And it's not just about resources. It's about the way they've been treated. It's about the way their country has been governed. It's about the way their citizenship rights have been defined. But at the top of it all is infrastructural deficiencies. Anyone who's been to Lagos or Abuja and you've been to the Niger Delta, you see that very clearly, okay? Let me give you some pictures. That's the Niger Delta. Interestingly enough, the building with red roof, that's brand new, okay? You can imagine what happened. Look at the pathway. That's a pipeline. And that's a major boulevard, okay, for the rural folk, okay? You look at Lagos, you look at Abuja, there's poverty, but it is far more pronounced in the very areas where oil mineral is mined. How about this? Youth unemployment, an area that I think we should pay more attention to, really, because a lot of the problems have arisen because youths have expressed their anger. Oftentimes they are used by older politicians and all of that. True, but why? In a very poor region of the world, where according to SACS, on average, $1 a day, if they are lucky, even within that, 75% are extremely poor in the oil-producing areas, okay? In River State, Port Harcourt, I grew up a mile and a half from Shell headquarters, directly east of my parents' home. Even there, poverty is one of the highest in the country. That's a nice, decent residential community. That's what passes for a residential community in the Niger Delta. Okay? The slums of the city. How about that? This last picture with the terminals, the storage tankers, it's really amazing. That is Bonny. an otherwise beautiful town. That's what it is. You fly over it, gas flaring, that's somewhere in Guinea land, pipeline burst, that's a local fisherman, oil spill. And these are not exaggerated, they happen to be the ones that at least the news media could capture and distribute to the rest of the world. Okay, so how about the internationalization? This is where it gets interesting. I think a lot of people, and Nigeria has been mentioned here several times, it's your worst case scenario of an oil resource country in Africa that went back. Hopefully nobody should repeat that. Chances are it will happen. Even to Ghana, probably even Uganda. I hope it doesn't. But part of the larger picture here is the nature of dictatorship and governance in Nigeria. Much more fundamental. As bad as Abacha was, and these dictatorships are bad, we saw that in Latin America, but they did some good in Latin America, at least economically. There are very few of them in Africa that did that. So they, not only were they bad politically, they were bad economically for Africans. And Abacha did that. But as bad as that did, I think what he did was, for the first time, at least in Nigeria, raise the consciousness that the best dictatorial government is worse than the worst democratic government. And that is a psychological shift, because for a long time, Nigerians would prefer military government. You know, when things go bad, and they always go bad. Say, oh, no, topple them. Abacha showed the limits of that logic, okay? But the result of that also was that, unbeknownst to him, he began to empower people like Sarawiwa and ordinary people who had basically taken it for so long and said, we can't take it anymore. And that began the process of mass empowerment, and I think elite antagonism, which he didn't expect. And then he drew the attention of the international system when Abacha then responded by hanging Sarawiwa. You guys remember that in 1995. So suddenly the UN and MUNU and international lawyers focused on Nigeria big time. What is going on here and why? And Goose began to demand, well, it's oil and all that. Things began to happen fairly quickly. Nigeria will transist. But look at also the method of internationalization after democracy came. Well, the militants began to kidnap foreign oil workers. And I'm using that in generic terms. Let me be more specific. Whites, okay? They targeted Americans. They targeted Europeans. Why? Their government will seek their release. Listen, if you kidnap a Nigerian or a Zambian, there is no government that will be coming to rescue them. So you might as well kill them, but you are not getting a buck. You kidnap an American, be certain that you will hear from somebody. So it was a strategy that worked effectively, because then it became shown on CNN, Financial Times, and the more that happened, the more attention they got, and the more something began to happen. Formation of militia and all that. Oops, get out. Okay, then it became full-blown anarchy, okay? But look at the response of the international community. Suddenly there emerged the Gulf of Guinea initiative. So now you know that, right? Bring all the states, all the way from Angola to the south, to as far north as Cote d'Ivoire. Bring them in and let's discuss a regional arrangement. And by the way, this is going to end with even Africa, okay? The US is now going to have a huge military thing to arrest the situations in Africa before all of Africa collapse. And oh, by the way, to threaten oil supplies to the US, the rest is story. But look, the states did not keep quiet, and I think that's a misunderstanding of what happened. The Nigerian state did not simply say we are not going to do anything about it. They did a lot. But what they did amounted to a reinforcement of patronage politics. Okay? They empowered a few elites who are likely to agree with them, and then they got the oil companies to engage in what I call tokenism. Anyone who is been to Niger Delta understands that Shelley will build a classroom that has a few chairs, maybe, a window, absolutely no air conditioning, in an environment where you've got 96-degree temperature all year round. So it's no different from a poor state building a school. Offer a few scholarships, not bad, I like that, but there could be more. And then, but it also came down to the very structure of federalism. How do we treat government? And then eventually, Niger Delta will produce a president. Okay, that's very interesting. Why does that matter? It matters because oftentimes as scholars, and I think international practitioners, we think that What is really at play here is the quality of government. It's not. What is at play here is the occupant of the office of the presidency, who is in government. Okay, and there it begins to take on a symbolic meaning. A Niger Delta person is president, therefore we feel like, and it reinforces the patronage politics. I want to go then, I will leave that. What kinds of lessons do we learn from this? First, I think we're going to have to think seriously about sustainable development. How do we get African governments to think beyond what they learned? And it's a very bad lesson for the colonial masters. That extraction is the way to go. How do you manage that, especially with African philosophy and ways of life? How do you coexist with your environment given what you have? You don't have to have a Mercedes to live a comfortable life, okay? You don't have to have a marble mansion to own a home. So all of that we have to come in. And I think it's a little bit more cultural than just simply dollars and cents. How do you sustain democracy? I think Africans have made a great effort. I think, John, your point is very well taken. A lot of things has happened in Nigeria and in much of Africa. We see the picture now. How do we sustain that? How do they become less vulnerable to external shocks? The third, and let me go to the fourth actually. How do we de-emphasize rent as the main source of revenue? The World Bank has done a lot of work in this area, and I hope that economists will push that. African governments rely on minimum rent as a source of revenue more than they do on taxation, especially income taxes. And we have to find a way to focus on income taxes. What does that do? It makes government take their people seriously. Anyone who knows anything about any African country understands that the first thing is that African governments do not respect their citizens. They may all be black. They may all live in camp from the same ethnic region. They have no, people in power have no respect for those who are not in power. That will happen if you depend on them for revenue. The second part of it is that it will help governments know who their people are and where they live. You need to have them in order to be able to find them. The third is that it's going to make job creation a priority of government. Folks have to earn income in order to pay taxes. The final part Eric mentioned is transparency. If we know how much you make, then we will know whether you'll be able to afford the kind of lifestyle that you're living. That will do a lot to curtail corruption. So that finally, this is really about accountability. That's my more recent work and where I'm focusing on. I think the talk about democracy and governance in Africa is really about accountability. How do Africans, all of us Africans, make those who govern us accountable? You see, Africans have not had that. Colonial governments were not accountable to Africans. Those who succeeded them were not. Look, colonial governments were accountable to European powers and European citizens who lived in Africa. African governments to this day remain very accountable to world bankers and the IMFers in a way that they do not focus on their own governments and their own citizens. And we have to be able to find a way to break that cycle. Thanks a lot.